Here we are, summarizing Chapter 8 of Giddens et al. Introduction to Sociology. And the topic being discussed in this chapter is stratification, class, and inequality. The learning objectives include learning about social stratification and the importance and social background in an individual's chances for material success. We will also come to familiarize ourselves with theories of stratification, including those of Karl Marx, Max Weber, Eric Olin Wright. We will recognize the class differences in the United States, what influences them, and how they're defined and determined, as well as recognize the ways in which the gap between the rich and the poor has grown larger, amongst other things. Social stratification. What is social stratification? Social stratification is the existence of structured inequalities between groups in society in terms of their access to material or symbolic rewards. While all society involve some form of stratification, only with the development of state based systems did wide differences in wealth and power arise. Intersectionality. Intersectionality is defined as a sociological perspective that holds that our multiple group membership affects our lives in ways that are distinct and single group memberships. For example, the experience of a black woman may be distinct from that of a white woman or a black man. Structured inequalities are simply social inequalities that results from patterns in the social structure. Systems of stratification. Systems of stratification looks at things such as slavery, the caste system, or class systems. Slavery is a form of social stratification in which some people are owned by others as property. Caste is a system where one social class is held for life. And the class system is a system of social hierarchy that allows individuals to move amongst classes. A class. Although it is one of the most frequently used concepts in sociology, there is no clear agreement about how the notion should be defined. Most sociologists use the term to refer to socioeconomic variations among groups of individuals that create variations in material prosperity and power. Life chances. Life chances is a term introduced by Max Weber to signify a person's opportunities for achieving economic prosperity. The idea of life chances is important because it emphasizes that although class is a powerful influence on what happens in our lives, it is not completely determining. Income. Income is simply money received from paid wages and salaries or money earned from investments. Wealth. Money and material possessions held by an individual or a group is considered wealth. Wealth inequality in America mirrors income inequality. Some scholars argue that wealth, not income, is a real indicator of social class because it is less sensitive to fluctuations, and racial disparities in wealth negatively influences a person's life outcome. Education. Education is one of the strongest predictors of occupation, income, wealth. Racial differences in education, of course, persist, which partly explains racial differences in income and wealth. How much education one receives is often influenced by social class, especially the social class of one's parents. Occupation. In the United States, occupation is an important indicator of social standing. The top ranked occupations require a fair amount of either education or public service. Younger Americans are more inclined to value occupations that result in fame. I'm not sure that I agree with that. I think young people today are not so much after fame, but I think economic wherewithal of occupations is an important choice today when young people think about going into an occupation. Lifestyle. According to sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, he saw social class groups as identifiable according to their levels of cultural and economic capital. Stratification amongst classes depend on differences in consumption and lifestyle, in addition to occupational differences. The reproduction of social inequalities are still primarily influenced by economic factors. Now, we're going to take a look at theories that explain stratification in modern societies. Among these theories is the concept by Marx of capitalism and his analysis of class. According to Marx, Marx breaks society down into different groups: the bourgeoisie, the proletariat, and not mentioned here, the lumpen proletariat. And what is important for Marx here is the concept of a means of production and who controls the means of production. Now, according to Marx, the person who controls the means of production is the person that ultimately has the power. He breaks down different groups in society, such as bourgeoisie, and bourgeoisie is the one who owns companies, or in other words, the one who owns the means of production, while the proletariat, according to Marx, is the one who sells their labor for wages. Then we have Max Weber, and Max Weber looks at class and status. Now, Weber agrees with Karl Marx to some extent. However, where he differs from Karl Marx is that he feels that it's not just economic resources, but he feels that things such as social classes or status also has an impact on how one perceives stratification. We have Davis and Moore that looks at the functions of stratification. According to Kingsley Davis and Wilbert E. Moore, they argued that social stratification and social inequality are functional because they ensure that the most qualified people, attracted by the reward society bestows, will fill the roles that are most important to a smoothly functioning society. Critics, however, point out that the functional importance of roles is difficult to measure, as social rewards do not accurately reflect the importance and the stratification limits of the discovery of talent in society. Eric Allen Wright looks at contradictory class locations. Wright incorporates concepts from Karl Marx and Max Weber, and he classifies three dimensions of control over resources: one, control over investments and money or capital; control over physical means of production; and control over labor power. According to Wright, contradictory class locations are positions in the class structure, particularly the white collar and lower managerial jobs that share characteristic with the class positions both above and below them. According to Wright, two factors differentiate class and locations: one, the relationship of authority, and two, the position of skills or expertise. Let's take a look at some research done on social stratification today. One of the research done is that of a contemporary portrait of the U.S. class structure, where most sociologists identify different classes in terms of wealth, income, and occupation, noting how social class influences consumption, education, health, and access to power. While there are no sharply defined boundaries between the classes, and no real agreement among sociologists about where boundaries fall, at the same time, different classes were identified. This includes the upper class, the middle class, the working class, and the lower class. The upper class is a social class broadly comprised of the more affluent members of society, especially those who have inherited wealth, own businesses, or hold large number of stocks. Globalization and the information revolution contributed to the rising number of super rich Americans in recent years. The middle class is a social group composed broadly of those working in white collar and lower managerial jobs. The number of Americans who identify as middle class has declined. The working class is a group that's identified based on those working in blue collar or manual occupations. And the lower class is a social class, those who work part time or not at all, or whose household income falls beneath a particular threshold. Social mobility, moving up and down the ladder. Social mobility is defined as the movement of individuals or groups between different social positions. There's intergenerational mobility, where movement up or down a social stratification hierarchy comes from one generation to another. Intragenerational mobility is the movement up or down a social stratification hierarchy within the course of a personal career. Structural mobility, mobility resulting from changes in the number and kinds of jobs that is available in society. Social mobility. This looks at what is considered cultural capital. What is cultural capital is non economic or cultural resources that parents pass down to their children, such as language or knowledge. These resources contribute to the process of social reproduction, according to Bourdieu. Downward mobility. Downward mobility looks at downward intergenerational mobility, and this has increased in recent years. Short range downward mobility looks at where a worker moves from one job to another in similar pay and prestige. Poverty in the United States. We have absolute poverty and we have relative poverty. Absolute poverty is not meeting the minimal requirements necessary to sustain a healthy existence, whereas relative poverty is poverty defined according to the living standards of the majority in a given society. Measuring poverty. An official government measurement used to define those living in poverty. Um, and so we have what is called a poverty line, and that is what the poverty line is. This calculates a budget. For example, for a family of four in 2020, the annual cash is just over $26,000 or about $2,000 a month to cover expenses. Critics argue that this formula greatly underestimates the amount of poverty because it overemphasizes the proportion of a family budget spent on things such as food, and it underestimates the share spent on housing. So let's say you were to apply for public assistance and you were earning $2,000 a month. It doesn't matter if 15 if 1,500 of that money went toward housing, that is not taken into account. What is taken into account is that you earn $2,000 per month. The working poor. The working poor are people who work, but their earnings are not sufficient to lift them out of poverty. While education can significantly impact the likelihood that someone will be among the working poor, it does not preclude it. Poverty, race, and ethnicity. I want to bring your attention to figure 8.3 on my right. Figure 8.3 speaks of the poverty rate in the United States, and it shows that there's a much higher rate of poverty amongst minority groups than amongst non Hispanic whites. Racial discrepancies in the median household income is because members of minority groups often work at the lowest paying jobs and because of racial discrimination. The feminization of poverty. I want to bring your attention to figure 8.4, again on my right. Um, the concept of the feminization of poverty refers to an increase in the proportion of poor who are female. This is particularly acute amongst families headed by Hispanic women or Black women. Children in poverty. There is a PowerPoint in the classroom that addresses children in poverty as seen through the eyes of Marion White Edelman. I would like to ask you to take a quick moment to review that PowerPoint. Actually, it's not a PowerPoint, it's a documentary, right? And so when we look at children in poverty, children, especially racial minority children and children of single mothers, are the principal victims of poverty in the United States. In 2018, almost 11% of non Hispanic white children were poor, compared to 29% of Black children, 25% of Hispanic children, and 41% of children who lived in a single mother household. Then we look at the elderly. Poverty rate estimates among older adults how widespread poverty is because poverty rates fail to consider high cost of medical care, which disproportionately strikes older adults. Because most older adults have retired from paid work, their income is based primarily on Social Security and private retirement groups or programs. A special case of poverty, homelessness. Homelessness are people who have no place to sleep and either stay in free shelters or sleep in public spaces not meant for habitation. And I'm sure when you drive on the train, you may see people just sleeping with their baggages because they have no place else to sleep. The fastest growing group of homeless people consists of families with children. Insufficient income and lack of affordable housing are the lead cause of homelessness, including things such as substance abuse and mental health. Question. Is inequality declining or increasing in the United States? Kuznets curve. This is a formula showing that inequality increases during the early stages of capitalist development, then declines, and eventually stabilizes at a relatively low level, advanced by the economic Simon Kuznets. Globalization and the declining role of governments are likely factors that have led to rising inequality. Why are poverty rates rising in the United States? So there are a lot of postulations for this, right? Culture of poverty. There's a thesis written by Oscar Lewis, and he argues that poverty is not a result of individual inadequacies, but instead is the outcome of a larger social and cultural atmosphere into which successive generations of children are socialized. When we look at the culture of poverty, it basically refers to things such as values, beliefs, lifestyle, habits, and traditions that are common among people living under certain conditions of material deprivation. Charles Murray argues that poverty is explained by the concept of welfare dependency in terms, in other words, he argues that people become dependent on welfare, and because of this, they are more likely to remain in poverty. Far from true. So far from true. Who wants to live a life that is relegated to poverty as determined if one lives on welfare? I don't think so. I think people are born intrinsically to want to rise above their circumstances. What can be done to combat poverty? Critics of government spending on poverty alleviation argue that it promotes welfare dependency. But there's a clear shift in opinion toward the belief that the government is failing to do enough to help the poor. And we saw during the COVID epidemic that as we took macroscopic lenses and looked at poverty, we realized that it was not an individual choice, but rather there were a lot of societal influences that tend to promote the continuation of poverty. How will these economic patterns affect your life? Question, food for thought. Stanford researchers found that young people entering the workforce today are considerably less likely to out earn their parents than young people born two generations before them. The overall number of jobs available in the future may not keep pace with the number of people with college degrees seeking work. Other countries are now a part of the global workforce, which must compete for jobs. So that is why you're trying to reach your local telephone company. You put in a call to their 1 800 number, and what you get is someone from overseas, right? So that tells you that jobs that historically should be here in the United States are being sourced out simply, again, because of a local workforce. On that note, that concludes the summary of Chapter 8, Introduction to Sociology by Giddens et al.